In this movie, we'll look at incorporating images into our application. We'll begin by creating a white background. The simplest way to load an image is to use the display.newImage method. For the argument, we'll pass in a string that represents the path to our image within our project folder. In my project folder, I've got a folder called Images, and within it 4 different images. I'll be going over the at2x extension for images in a later movie. Let's take a look at the result in the simulator. The image is loaded into our application. By default, Corona will use the top left corner of the image for its positioning. This is called the reference point. We can change the reference point for the image by using the setReferencePoint method of the image object. For the argument, we'll pass in a constant that represents the new reference point. Here, we'll set the reference point to the center of the image. Let's take a look at the result in the simulator. Now, we'll reposition the image on the screen. What I've done here is set the x of the image to half of the width of the screen. The width of the screen is represented on line 2 as a constant. I'm then multiplying it by 0.5 in order to cut it in half. I'll do the same thing for the height. Let's view our app in the simulator. Now, the foo image is in the center of the screen. Another way to create an image in Corona is to use the display.newImageRect method. As with display.newImage, we'll pass in a string that is the path to the file. For the next 2 arguments, we'll pass in the width and height of the image. When creating an image with display.newImageRect, the reference point is set to the center of the image. So now we just need to position the image with x and y. The bar image is now over the foo image. Remember that display objects that are called later in your script will appear over top of other display objects. To load an image from a remote location, such as the internet, we'll need to use display.loadRemoteImage. Here, we won't be assigning a variable to display.loadRemoteImage. Instead, we'll call the method, and then we'll create a listener to assign the image to a variable. First, we'll create a variable that acts as a forward reference. This means that we'll create an empty variable and we'll assign it later. Now, we'll call display.loadRemoteImage. The first argument represents the path to the image. Since it's a remote image, it'll be a URL address. The second argument represents the manner by which we'll get the image, get or post. The third argument is the callback function. This function will be called when there's a response from the server. The fourth argument is a file name for the image to store locally. Since I'm running out of space, I'll type a comma and hard return to the next line. Remember that Lua is whitespace independent. The next argument is where to store the file in our app. We'll store it in a temporary directory. I'll go over file and data management later on in this series. Finally, we'll pass in the left and top values of the image. Here we'll type in 00. Now, we'll create the load image callback function. E represents the callback event. Within this function, we'll type the following. We'll test to see first if we've got an error. If e.isError, then, and we'll put a comment here. We're expecting a successful result here, so we'll go to the else clause. I like to close my conditions ahead of time. So within the else clause, we'll assign the image to the remote image variable. Remote image equals e.target. And e.target represents the image that was loaded from the server. Now we can position and affect our image. We'll set the image alpha to 0 and fade the image in. Remote image.alpha equals 0, and remote image.x, we'll put it at the center of the screen, and we'll also put the center Y. Now from the center of the screen, we'll offset it by 150 pixels downward. Now if we were to run this now, we wouldn't see anything. That's because we set the alpha to 0. So let's fade it in using a transition. I'll cover transitions and animations in more detail later on in this title. Let's save it and take a look at the result. We see the bar image fade in as it's loaded remotely from the server. We've gone over 3 different ways to create images. One is using display.newImage. The other is to use display.newImageRect. We'll use this as the dominant method for loading images. Finally, to load remote images, we used display.loadRemoteImage. This last method is useful for loading images from the web.